Islam, Presentation 1. The origins of Islam are as follows. First, Islam is the second largest religion in the world. It has about 1.5 billion adherents as of about 5 years ago, and Christianity is the largest. By contrast, it had about 2.1 at that time. It is also the latest to have started. It started in the early 7th century in Arabia from the monotheism of the Prophet Muhammad. Early 7th century meaning that he died about 630, as it will turn out, and and the religion started about that time. He was actually born in the late 600s, late 500s, which we'll refer to below. While it's known as an Arabian a religion of Arabian origins, it's 75% now non-Arab, and the largest Muslim country is Indonesia over in Southeast Asia. The origins for Islam, they trace themselves to they trace themselves back to the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures, to Adam and Noah and Shem, to Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, about 1800 BCE. Hagar was in the Hebrew scriptures, was known as a servant of Sarah's. In the Islamic tradition, she is known as the wife of Abraham. It is acknowledged and known that Hagar and her son Ishmael were banished, and they went from where they were somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, perhaps Canaan. They were known to have gone all the way down to Mecca in their banishment, and they are considered descendants to Muhammad. I use these guarded terms like considered and known as because there is little historical documentary evidence that, in other words, written down that that Muhammad and that Ishmael and Hagar had a direct lineage that way, but that is the way that Muslims understand their origins. A major event to them was in fact regarding Abraham's attempted sacrifice of his son Isaac in Genesis 22. This is not related to Ishmael per se, but it's considered to demonstrate from Abraham, and therefore high priority with his son Ishmael, the extraordinarily devoted submission that he had to the will of God. And so that's a major factor within Islam. The term Islam, with the important letters being SLM, from which comes Salem, also in Arab, and Shalom in Hebrew, mean submission and peace. Submission primarily to God, and peace with God as a result, and also as an extra result, peace among people. Submission to God's will and the guidance of God, and living in peace with oneself and surroundings include, therefore, inner peace, pardon me, as one finds as a high priority in most religions. So we go to the follow-up of that is that Islam is both a political and a religious community, and they consider the political as important as the religious, and they consider them not to be separated. The emphases in Islam are on monotheism, the singleness of God, the oneness of God, and strict behavioral standards that came from Muhammad and the tradition following him. They consider that Islam is a religion that is purifying, excuse me again, purifying and fulfilling the corruptions which have arisen in first Judaism and subsequently Christianity. Now we come to Muhammad as the founder of the religion. He is considered messenger of God. This is similar to being a prophet, and we'll see what the distinction is, and it's a rather important one that they make on this at a later point. The traditional account of Muhammad, whether he was born in Mecca in 570 CE, his father died before he was born. And so this has a little similarity to Siddhartha Gautama. His mother died when he was at the age of 6, and so it came to be his grandfather who raised him for a short time and was influential in his formation. Influential because his grandfather was a very important person in Mecca as the custodian of the temple Kaaba. The temple Kaaba still exists, and it's the great cube that is a holy place for the Muslims. Back to the custodian. His father, as custodian, we would think of a person pushing a broom perhaps, but custodian means that he had custody of the temple. He was the person in charge of it. He managed it. And so he had a very important position in the religion that was represented at the Kaaba. This religion, by the way, seems to have been a combination of several religions, and we'll see that Muhammad has as his goal to purify it and take it back to its holy roots. Anyway, his father dies when Muhammad is about 8 years old, 2 years later. And then he is raised by also an influential person in terms of travel, Abu Talib. He goes with his uncle on trips because his uncle is a trader. And on a trip to Syria, that would be north of Arabia, a Christian monk noticed Muhammad and said that the child had the marks of a prophet. What those marks consisted of, we don't have any more detail. They could have been physical, they could have been character. But in any case, he noted that similar to the marks that were noticed on Siddhartha Gautama at his birth, indicating that he would be either a great king or a great teacher. So, similarly with Muhammad, it would seem. Meanwhile, as a child, he was a shepherd. As a young man, he joined the merchant caravans. So he took up the trading systems. And by 25, he was serving a wealthy widow named Khadijah. She plays a very important role in his life. She's 15 years older. She's 40 when he is 25. They fall in love and they marry. And that brings us to approximately 595 BCE. And we come to the major turning point in his life, a divine revelation. So the next page. It is 15 years later, when he is 40, in the year 610, when he experiences the angel Gabriel coming to him. This angel and other angels were associated with various major figures of the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament: Abraham, Moses, Samuel, and Joseph, and Jesus. And he is given a message from Gabriel from God. And he wrote this down: recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from clots of blood. Recite, for thy Lord is most beneficent, who has taught the use of the pen, has taught man that which he knew not. You can see from the reference that this is found in the Quran, in the 96th chapter, out of about 114, I believe it is. And I want to dwell on this to note with you the emphases that one finds in Islam coming from this this message and command to recite these words, command to Muhammad. First of all, the Lord who created. And so in Islam, there's a great deal of emphasis on the Lord, Allah, as the creator of all people. Secondly, he created men from clots of blood. Now, if one read Genesis, one would get more the impression that that it was from dirt, and that man was formed, and into him was breathed the breath of life. But by this time, there was more scientific understanding within culture generally, and this religion, and Muhammad in particular. And so he conceived of man he understood from the angel that man was created from clots of blood. And then we come to beneficent. It means person who does good for someone. And so the Lord, Allah, is to be understood as a kind person who does good for other people. And then the word pen. Also by this time, there was an emphasis on education within the culture. And so it was seen as Allah who provided the use of the pen for writing things down. And finally, to Allah is attributed the teaching to men of that which they knew not, or that which he knew not, man's singular there. And the point of this is that one must depend on word from God to understand many things. And God provides, because he has taught men revelation so that they will know things that they would not otherwise know. Well, the result of this vision and visitation by the angel Gabriel was that Muhammad was considered either a man possessed or a prophet. By those who do not follow Islam, he might seem like a man possessed because, and to those who follow Muhammad, he seemed to be a prophet, to be receiving word from God, just as uh, Hebrew prophets and Jesus had received word from God similarly. This um, visitation from Gabriel and others recurred. It was seen to be under spiritual inspiration and spiritual guidance um, for Muhammad. And so it was preparing him to be a person of spiritual importance in developing viewpoints that God wanted, that Allah wanted developed. Allah, by the way, is the uh, term God in Arabic, and he is known by the term Allah, um, just as we would call the Supreme Being God, kind of the generic category term. Well, meanwhile, the explanation of these unusual phenomena by skeptics is that Muhammad was in fact subject to seizures uh, from this point in his life on. Since when he had these visitations, it would be with trembling and sweating and hallucinations, as is known from the record of them. Muhammad's view, however, was one of divine intervention. He understood himself as the Rasulullah, the messenger or prophet of God. Rasul is actually the word for messenger. The word for prophet is Navi, as one finds in Hebrew. But he is the messenger of God and the supreme messenger, though there are others. Um, he was ridiculed as a sorcerer, a magician, and Jesus had some similar treatment by leaders of his own tribe, um, and was considered a threat to Meccan social and economic life. Um, his threat was partly related to the fact that he preached in a way that the establishment, please remember Jesus was similar in this way, in a way that the establishment did not appreciate and had not authorized. He preached on social justice. He preached on justice against the privileged. So he needed to be suppressed as heretical. Under these conditions of threat, he, however, was safe with his uncle, but his uncle died about 620 and led to Muhammad's departure. And so 620 would place Muhammad at about the age of 50. And so he has to leave town, bringing us to the next page. This departure was known as the Hijra or the Hejira, a flight. That's the term for flight, meaning rapid departure. Of course, nothing in the air involved here. And he departed to Yathrib, later the city of Medina, about 75 miles to the north of Mecca. And he was able to mediate disputes and mediate a dispute for them at that time and get protection from them against the Meccans who were trying to get rid of him. They protected him and his followers, and the time of his flight was precisely September 24th, 622. And this flight year, as it is called, is very important. It's not exactly when his ministry began, as we will study it, but it was a point of his independence that is considered the beginning of the Muslim calendar. He won over Medina. He became an influential person there. He had his own charismatic character from the confidence that he got from those encounters with Gabriel the angel. And he won over Medina, and he instituted ordinances as a result that you can see are both sociological and political, as well as religious, on marriage, divorce, fasting, alms, slaves, prisoners of war, and enemies. And so we find these kinds of emphases when we come to the Quran, as a matter of fact, because they're on the basis of these visions, and the Quran is a record of these visions that these experiences that Muhammad had with the angels. By this time, he married several women, and these would be political marriages after the death of Khadijah. It's important to Muslims to note that until Khadijah died, he was only married to one woman. But after that, he married several. He is over 50 by now, and these are political alliances to cement his relationships with other major leaders of the area of Medina and surrounding areas. So what we have here in this early forming of the religion is civil and religious authority is fused as a Muslim state. It became something of a country, a nation, an ethnic entity of its own. Muhammad was deemed the super chieftain. And we come then to the surrender of Mecca. The war against Mecca occurred, I believe it was between 628 and 630. And by 630, Mecca had been taken from a combination of diplomacy and military pressure by Muhammad on the authorities in Mecca. He had a ceremony to cleanse the temple Kaaba. He walked around it 7 times. This is a bit reminiscent of the Hebrew scriptures in Joshua, walking around, marching around Jericho and seeing the walls fall down, but the walls of the Kaaba did not fall down. This was a spiritual purification process. The spiritual character, however, extended to acts upon the Kaaba itself of destroying images and paintings of Abraham and the angels. He walked to the Zamzam well, which was related to where Hagar and Ishmael first stopped at Mecca, because it was where they got water and settled. And so that's part of the initiation that he provided too. So going on to the next page, we find that he restored boundary pillars for the sacred territory of Mecca. And they adopted the term Muslim, Muslims, which is Arab for those who have submitted. As I said about Islam, referring to submission and peace, so also Muslim is related to Islam. You have the same S, L, and M, from which Islam gets Muslim. Those who have submitted, who have taken a pilgrimage to Mecca, that is what the Muslim word signifies. So we come to the triumph of Muhammad over Mecca, and he made the territory in Arabia a theocracy. With theocracy means a government by God. understanding him to be God's messenger. And so this puts him at the head of a government that is actually God's will for the people of Arabia. And the tribes were united by loyalty to a concept, a sociological concept of ummah, meaning community. The final discourse constitutes a shift in loyalties that Muhammad commands. O believers, listen to my words and take them to heart. Know that every Muslim is a brother unto every other Muslim, for you are now one brotherhood. And that term brotherhood is ummah. And this comes also from the Quran, we see. He died in 632 from a short illness, and thus starts the religion on its way with him as its founder. Islam through the ages. First of all, we have the four caliphs or caliphs. The term caliph, we will find, means successor. It does not mean that they are messengers or prophets, but rather they are successors to the authority of Muhammad in Islam. The four caliphs started with a leadership crisis. The Sunnis, one of the groups, they were the traditionalists, and they are the vast majority of the Muslims to this day, believe that there was no successor to Muhammad. The Shiites, however, believe that, which term means partisans, claim that Muhammad designated his cousin Ali, also a son-in-law, and two fathers-in-law met with leaders in Medina to select a leader. And the one chosen was Abu Bakr, an older man. And he was deemed not a messenger or a prophet, but rather Khalifa, the successor. Only administrative responsibilities, not prophethood. And so he was to manage the ongoing of the religion. The results was that there were divisions in the Arabian groups. But they were stopped. There was planned expansion by Islam into Syria, that would be north of Arabia, and into the Byzantine Empire, that would be further north around the Mediterranean into Turkey. Byzantine Empire, by the way, is referring to a Christian empire of Eastern Christianity. The first part of the expansion involved expansion under Umar. He is the second caliph under after Abu Bakr. And please notice that Umar, his work extended from 634 to 644, and he worked on two fronts, one to the north and west, the Christian Byzantine Empire, and Persia to the east. He executed and managed the conquest of three of the four Christian patriarchates, that is, Christian major centers. The one in Antioch for Syria in 636. He conquered Jerusalem and Palestine, 638, and Alexandria in Egypt in 642. In the process, also farther to the east, north and east, Iraq and Iran were taken. The requirements that were instituted were that they would live in peace and that they would accept Umar's protection. and of course, as a conquered people, that they would pay taxes to the Islamic State. So on to the next continuation of that. They, however, similar to Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors, could keep their own religion and customs. The foundation that thereby laid for the Arab and Islamic empire. Now, the next caliph, Uthman, another son-in-law of Muhammad, of the Umayyad family, and he reigned from 644, or he ruled from 644 to 656, another extended reign of 12 years. He strengthened control without expanding it. He consolidated the Islamic religion and its growing empire, but he was assassinated. Then we come to Ali, who was appointed Caliph IV by Medina, but he was not accepted by Mecca. He was assassinated in 661, 5 years later, and Muawiyah became Caliph after him. And Muawiyah brings us to the Umayyad dynasty of 661 to 750, a 90-year period, you may notice. And in Islam, one thing that one learns that becomes most evident here is that there are dynasties, there are lengthy families, large clan families. And so the Umayyad dynasty is the first of the great dynasties, lasting nearly 100 years in Islam. Muawiyah, the most recent caliph, was a statesman. He moved the caliphate to Damascus, that is, once again, in Syria, and he developed a distinctive Islamic civilization in Damascus, in contrast to the Christianity that was there at that time. There was expansion and centralization and systemizing of teaching under Muawiyah. One thing to note about the teaching is that this is now for 30 years to 120 years after Muhammad has died, and that is when the writing down of things about Islam gets to be going in earnest. More about that when we talk about the Holy Scriptures. Next we come, after the Umayyad dynasty, to the Abbasid dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty lasting till 750, they were defeated in 732 by the Christian Charles Martel the Hammer, and on to the next page we find that the Abbasids out in the east in Iraq developed a new Islamic center of importance. An Iraqi aristocracy moved to the center of Islam from Damascus to Baghdad. Baghdad is similar in location to Babylon, and so what we have here is a moving close to the center of the strong Jewish culture that started 1,000 years earlier in Babylon. And then the Umayyad Caliphate continued after its defeat, but it continued in the west, having moved from Damascus in the east to Spain in the west, starting in 750. And please notice the length of that caliphate, of that period of Islamic cultural development and dominance of Spain, 756 to 1236, about 500 years. They were succeeded by a Moorish, that means from the south, from North Africa, Moorish Caliphate at Granada, and the culture lasted all the way to 1492, another 250 years. By this time, there came the wane of the Abbasids after the 9th century, after the 800s, from rivals in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and Iran. Now, to give you a geographical perspective, Tunisia and Syria were off on the North African coast, Tunisia and Egypt, and Syria and Iran, by contrast, were to the east, going east from the eastern edge of the Mediterranean into desert territory. And so we come to the pinnacle of Islamic cultural development in the 8th and 9th centuries by the by Islam of that day, 8th and 9th, 700s and 800s. And they were accomplished in medicine, science, mathematics, art, and philosophy, very much of a holistic kind of religion incorporating the sciences and humanities, as we might put it. By 900, Turkish masters of Abbasid caliphs caused difficulty. These Turkish masters came from what we know of as Turkey, but the Turks, in fact, got the name and came from the north, from the Asian areas that we associate now with Russia. It was the Seljuk Turks that took Jerusalem in 1070. This would be right before the Crusades. Their brutality in seizing it and conquering Jerusalem against the Christians led to great anger and motivation by the Christians for their crusades. Jerusalem was captured by the Christians, recaptured by the Christians some 90 years later. It was captured by the Christians about 1099, but it was retaken by Muslims by 1187, about 100 years after the Crusade conquest. By this point, there are some non-Muslim groups that wreck Islamic Baghdad, and there comes to be a Mongolian empire with nomads from Northeast Asia, and these are the same areas generally from which the Turks came. This led to these came from Mongolia, Manchuria, Siberia, so that by 1200, Genghis Khan was making conquests across Asia, and he spread contact between diverse peoples, somewhat like we found earlier that Alexander the Great did, connecting one ethnic group with another. And related to him by 1279 to 1294 came Kublai Khan, who had an empire, if you can fathom this geographically, from the Pacific, that means beyond China, including all of China, to the Danube, that means Eastern Europe, a vast area. And then by 1256, Hulagu Khan made conquests into Iran, going south into the into the Middle East, as it would be termed, some 40 years later. And by 1295, the area had become Islamic, converted to Islam. The Ottomans proceeded then to destroy the Iraqi Caliphate, that was the one at Baghdad, and the Ottomans established their own empire, founded in Turkey in 1300. They were named for a great leader of theirs, their original leader, Osman. And this empire actually lasted 600 years till 1922. There were wide variations in its extent, but it included at various times Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean, Africa, the northern part of it, and the northeast part of the Mediterranean, as well as southeastern Europe. Vast areas were conquered by the Ottoman Empire and held to greater or lesser extents through those many centuries of 600 years. Then we come in 1453 this is during this time, and it's one of those within the Ottoman Empire, Mehmet II. In 1453, he conquered Constantinople from the Christian Byzantine Empire, and that was a major conquest about the same time as there came to be what's called the Renaissance in Western Europe. And so Christian Byzantine Empire now came under the domination of the Greek Orthodox, under the domination of Islam, and the Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church came to be protected by Islam, as the Jews were, and were allowed to coexist, practice their religion, as long as, and retain their customs, as long as they once again paid taxes to the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Well, now we consider the Shiites who break away and are punished severely in a period of the early 1500s, and then a great person of an interesting name, Suleiman the Magnificent, ruled, and this is rather the peak of Ottoman rule, for 45 years, the Ottoman Empire that included Eastern Europe, and the Ottoman Empire also assisted Protestants in being protected against Roman Catholic persecution because of the Protestant Reformation for about 2 centuries. Then we come to the Mughal Empire. We are moving now from Turkey and Europe back to the east, to India. Islam was affected by the Mongolians, which is what the word Mughal comes from. And by 1526, Babar, descendant of Mongolians, established the Islamic Mughal Empire. Notice that he had converted the territory to Islam, or to put it another way, Islam had managed to influence this invading Mughal Empire from the north into India and establish its own people group and religious center in India. The grandson, Akbar the Great, was famous in the second half of the 1500s in expanding that empire out to the east, out to the west, to include, besides India, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And there was conversion of the lower classes, and there was a fusion of Indian traditions with Mongol, Iranian, and Arabian, so that it became a cosmopolitan religion. In other words, more than one country. There was progress, but then there was reaction against the emperor that followed, Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1707, and there was a fusion of indigenous cultures and Mongol elements from Mongolia. And then comes the 1600s, 1700s, 17th, 18th centuries. There were problems regarding forced conversions of Hindus, problems for the for Islam, because of forced conversions of Hindus and Sikhs, and violence resulted. And so there was brutality from 600 to 1800. It was from religious hegemony, that means rule elsewhere. Pious Muslims accepted, and still do, that military success indicates divine favor. This brings us up to 1800. The Ottoman and Mughal empires were overcome by European powers. To give you perspective on who those powers were France and Germany and Spain and Italy against the Ottoman Empire, and it was the British Empire against the Mughal Empire as they took over the rule from the expanding British Empire of India. Now comes the most striking change in Islam in its whole history. There's the abolishment of the caliphate. Muslim communities were very backward and traditional and old-fashioned by the 17 and 1800s, and so modernity in the Renaissance in Western Europe was expanding and creating new military means, new weapons, and so forth. And they expanded to Africa, West Asia, and India. And these were the empires of Britain, the trading empire of the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent, French and Spanish empires, but mainly the British. And so the Muslims came to a point that the Ottoman establishment was considered un-Islamic, and they questioned the authority of the Sultan in Istanbul, Constantinople, over Islam. And the Caliphate finally, in 1924, here's a date to remember, basically was dissolved. The head of state representing the succession to the Prophet was stopped in March 3rd of 1924, abolished by the Turkish National Assembly after 1,300 years. Now we come to the person involved in this centrally. His name was Mustafa Kemal. Ataturk was his nickname. Ata means father, Turk means of the Turks. So Ataturk means the father of the Turks. He's the first president of the Republic of Turkey after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and he was champion of modern Turks nationalism. They became a nation rather than a religion. The idea of a single caliph Exercising supreme religious authority over all the peoples of Islam is an idea taken from fiction, not from reality. So spoke Mustafa Kemal in making Turkey a nation, no longer a theocracy, if you recall the word. So, the impact of modernity on Islam. Modernity was considered unfaithfulness to Islam and favored Western views. However, let me hasten to add that Turkey to this day is a very Islamic country. The numbers are probably something like 95, 99% Islamic and 1% all others, which would mainly be Eastern Orthodox Christians. And so, although there is a democracy or a republic or a nation in name, the country of Turkey is largely Islamic in religion, almost totally. And it's still very hard to be anything but Muslim within the country of Turkey. The ruling elites, however, in the meantime, and now we're talking about the early 20th century, were educated in Western values and Western views. These were considered unrepresentative of the Muslim masses and unfaithful to Muslim ideals. Their aim was conformity with Sharia, divine law. That's what that word means. Sharia was what came from God and provided a good way of living that is spelled out in the Quran. The result was that there was, also in the 20th century, 50 years later, an Iranian revolution gaining now in African societies as it spread its influence. And so that is where the development of Islam has taken us to this day. Now let us speak briefly about the status of women, which is a very controversial one in Islam. Are men and women equal before God? Islam insists that the answer is yes, they are equal before God. But as Muslims that we have had in class have noted, and as the book notes, it is not quite so equal in practice. There is discrimination and there is some oppression of women. There's tension and destruction, even in the West, against women by Islamic men. And the Quran legal proscriptions, that means prohibitions, not allowed. Proscriptions means legal disallowals, are that marriage is contractual, it's not sacramental. In other words, it's not seen as a religious matter, it's seen as a civil matter. The bride's rights are determined by her status, the contract, and the provision before any sex is allowed. Sex outside marriage is, of course, prohibited. The violators are punished, and divorce can happen only after requirements are met, and the inheritance of a woman is only half of the male's inheritance. So completes our initial presentation on Islam.